Welcome to the Ardan Labs Podcast. Our special guest today, all the way somewhere in Europe, is Hana Mohan. Hana, oh my goodness, I'm so happy that you're here and you're going to talk to us today.
So am I. I have to say, I've been a little bit anxious because I've listened to so many of the great episodes already, but definitely very excited. Yeah. Thank you for
I-
having me.
This is going to be another great episode, Hannah. I'm really excited to talk to you. I've only recently kind of met you. Somehow you ended up in my not Twitter profile, but Twitter timeline. In fact, I'm trying to think how that even every once in a while somebody new kind of falls into my
I remember
timeline.
actually, yeah, that it was pretty recent, as you said. I
Yeah.
was during the Christmas break. I was looking for Go resources, and I started seeing your course because it was recommended on Reddit. And then I think I just tweeted saying that this is one of the benefits of spending Christmas break alone, and I actually like sort of meant it quite sincerely, and I think like you replied back to that one or something like that. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Brilliant. So where are you coming from? Yeah, I know you're in Europe. I think it was Spain. You living
I
in
am in
Spain right
Spain. I
now?
live in Barcelona. I've been here for actually about 5 years now.
Oh,
And
nice.
I'm originally from India. I did a little bit of the whole sort of live elsewhere thing. I was actually in Colombia for a little bit. I know you have a connection, a Colombian connection.
I mean, I
And
don't know who that connection would be. Sorry, my wife, Ale. Yes, I married a beautiful Colombian woman. I've only been there once, but you got to live there for a couple of years, huh?
yeah, 2.5 years actually. And so that's where I was before Barcelona. And now I've been here for about 5 years. So yeah.
I mean, that's a massive sort of difference between living in South America and then living in Europe and then even living in India, right? Like these are all completely different sort of cultures, ways of life, just everything. So, which one do you like the most so far?
I think you're actually right. I mean, Europe itself is very different from South America, but then Spain definitely has some, I guess, South American feel to it, right? Like it's almost like this bridge between Europe and South America. It's definitely more. At times it feels more Europe than South America, and then at times it feels more South America than Europe. I'd say I actually do like living in Europe a lot. I loved Colombia, lovely people, and beautiful nature. I would love to go back for that. But I think life just has more access here for me, especially coming with an Indian passport and some other things. So I'd say this is where I love living the most. And I guess I just love big cities as well. So I still keep thinking about moving to London. So all that plays a big factor in my, I'd say, decision or what I like. I mean, I loved Bogota. I don't know if you've been in Colombia, but
No,
that can
I
be,
didn't go to Bogota.
yeah, it can be pretty
But
like busy.
I'm with you. I like the big city. I like being able to walk out of a door and having access to things without having getting in the car. I do have some like farmland in Kentucky, and I don't mind going there for a week, but like not having access to even just a local bar where I can just have a like one drink, like it drives me crazy. It's fine to escape, but I couldn't live that life 24/7.
Yeah, I'm with you on it, 100%. I've accepted and embraced that about myself actually now.
All right. So this is a podcast about you, and I've got a ton of questions, and I want to kind of hear your story. But before we do that, first thing is give everybody about 2 minutes of what you're doing today. What is Hannah doing right now today?
So for the last 2 years, I've been working on a startup called MagicBell. We graduated from Y Combinator a couple of years back, and we built the API and components for adding a notification inbox to your product. So if you use Notion or if you use one of our customers' pitch, a lot of applications add a notification inbox that shows you in real time what notifications you're getting, lets you manage your notification preferences, or if you're offline, send you an email. We basically give you that whole system as a plug and play component. Yeah, I mean, I love this problem space and I've been on it for 2.5 years or so now.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you just a couple questions now, but I don't want to go too deep.
Sure.
What got you interested in this space? Was there like a hole in your life in a previous job where you were just it was killing you, like you didn't have this notification that you needed to be responsive, and you thought, you know what, I'm going to build this tech, or I can build it better?
I did actually feel the need for it for many years. I've always been building products, and for every product I built, I kind of had to build this. And then also, I think the bar just kept getting higher, where now there's mobile notifications and in-app, and just felt that if there was a need yesterday, then today it was even stronger. So, and I was just looking for a change from my previous startup for many reasons, and I figured I would rather work on an API service this time and be more closer to engineers myself. And this just fits so many of those bills. And it obviously had some challenges and has challenges, but I think many of the reasons why I got into this space have definitely sort of like held true or become stronger.
So is the idea that I integrate Magic Bell in my admin tooling, like behind the scenes, or is right for me to be able to know what's happening with the customers that are using my product?
Well, so we are different from, let's say, something like an intercom or mailing list software. I mean, you could use that if that's what you were referring to, kind of like back operations and sending notifications like that. Not so much. I'd say more if you are, let's say, GitHub, and GitHub actually does have a notification bell, right? And where you can see all the pull requests that you've been assigned to or things that are getting merged. But most people don't use it because it's basically unmanageable. I mean, they've tried to make it much better, but it's a hard problem. So I'd say MagicBell is more for that use case where you want your software to notify your customers about open workflow loops they have or things they need to take care of. You can almost think of it like a start screen for your software. It's a metaphor I've used sometimes as well.
Nice. And it's the idea is that it's kind of plug and play in any sort of front end, I guess browser based front end or mobile app that I'm building.
That's correct. I mean, our strongest presence, at least in the UI today, is React. So we can package up a React embeddable, and you can add it to any other framework. But the strongest presence is in React, and then you can take it apart. You can pick out some components, or you can like swap them out with something more custom. But yeah, otherwise you can drop it into any other framework as well.
Okay. Brilliant. Okay. So we're going to get back to this at the end because I have more questions, but I don't want to ask now. I want to kind of rewind the clock a little bit to try to get an idea of how you got there today in like 2023, right? So a couple of things. Unfortunately, I have to kind of ask. I don't know how. I'm assuming that you went to grade school in India,
I
right? And you
actually did
finished your
almost
grade
everything in
school.
India until I was 27 years old. So, yeah, all my schooling, all my sort of undergrad or college, whatever you call it. And then even working for a while, I worked for a while in India as well. So, yeah, I did it in India.
So just because I don't know how the grade school
Sure.
system works in India, I'd be curious to know. When I don't know how the grade school system works, I usually ask, um, kind of what year did you start your undergraduate? You said you went to university. So what
Yeah,
year was it when you started your undergraduate work?
so I think like what you think of as high school, graduating from high school is probably more like a class 12th, which is like high school plus 2 more years of school for us.
Yeah, 12. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've graduated from high school in that sense from in the year 2000 actually, and then
2000. Oh, so you're like my daughter. Okay. My daughter
I think so.
graduated her 12th grade in
Yep.
2000. Okay.
So
I'm
I
asking because it helps put
sure.
tech. It helps to put the dates around tech, right? All right, sweet. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Keep going.
Oh no worries. And then I started undergrad a year later because I just went to a very
No, 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 no,
competitive
no, don't,
school.
no, 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 don't,
Yeah.
don't jump there.
Sure. Sure.
I want to get there. I'm trying to set a. I like that marker because when you graduate high school or you just start university, you tend to be around 18,
Yep.
17, 18, and it gives me kind of
Full
good
of
sense of.
hope and enthusiasm. Yeah.
Here's my favorite question, and you probably have heard this if you've listened to a few podcasts, but I really need this to be
Yeah.
spontaneous.
Sure.
So, so the first thought that pops in your head when you remember about working on a computer, first time you saw that computer, first time it was sort of magical to you, and you got Magic Bell in the name of your company now. right? Like magic. So when was that first like magical moment? Do you remember it?
I think I do. I mean, I obviously like I heard that question on your podcast, but I actually didn't think of the answer very much. So you are, for better or for worse, getting spontaneous answers. I believe it was in we moved to a new city, and then I joined a school. I must have been um, probably 12 at the time, and they had a computer lab. And I remember both the computer and the computer lab because, those were one of the few places that had air conditioning and such quiet, clean environments. And because computers were like so sensitive back then, I think. So I remember that moment, yeah. And I think the green terminal. Yeah, so it was, I think for me, just a very kind of visually strong moment. I don't think I had like any kind of terminal experience or anything, but just visually it stayed with me, I think, yeah.
Wow. And then, okay, so that's like that first moment you really saw a computer and it was somewhat but after that, did you have any access to the like what were you doing around that age? I mean, you saw the computer. Did you ever really get to get your hands on it? Did you get to play with it?
Yeah, I think we had some of those like courses on hex math or whatever, binary and things like that. And I remember most of it was just in a notebook, like an actual notebook, not a computer notebook. And finally, I think we got access to 1 hour a week of doing some basic programming. And I think that was like pretty phenomenal to just see that, okay, you can lay out report cards using the software. And I think like Basic was a cool language in a way that it was simple to get started with. So you could feel pretty productive pretty quickly, I think. And I remember definitely like noting that, wow, you could like do some real world like things with a computer already. And that's the extent of what I think I thought about then.
But what were you kind of interested in, if you can remember? Because this is, just you're probably about 12. You're going to enter that last 4 years of sort of grade school in a couple of years. But do you kind of remember the things that you were interested in at that time or you were spending your time doing?
That's a very good question. I think, when I think of my childhood, for one reason or the other, I have this sort of image of sort of like moving through a movie, right? Like kind of like almost like it's playing on a television. And so it feels like it's more of a blur than it should really be. But I remember like not having very one of the things that I listen to interviews and or read about it, and I feel sometimes that I never had very strong opinions about anything back in the day. Like I was just one of those kids that if I was told do this well, I would do it well. um, but I do remember like slowly getting more interested in computers, especially programming. Just you know I remember this one thing very distinctly where I got an assignment to write, as I said, like a report card in BASIC, and I wrote it, and I was so. I think that the experience stayed with me so strongly that I wanted to do it again. And then at my mom's school, where she used to teach or work, I got access to a computer for like an hour in between something randomly. And I remember writing down that whole program from a piece of paper on which I'd been writing in between and running it, and it just ran in one shot, never to be saved and run again. And somehow I do look back at that and think that, wow, that's pretty amazing for something I was like interested in back then. So I don't know if that answers it, but yeah.
I mean, that's all. Yeah. I remember again around that same age, right? 14, I was eighth grade, ninth grade, where when I didn't have the computer in front of me because I had to go somewhere or somebody's house, I would always have a notebook and I'd be writing code in the notebook, basic. I was doing basic at the time. And I'd be writing the code in the notebook, right? Because I had to code this thing out. And then the moment I got home, it was all just like typing in as fast as I could, right? So yeah, that I appreciate that sort of experience where you're just like, I have to keep coding. I see it with my wife right now because she started a boot camp and I told her, and I've said this, I think, in a couple other podcasts, but it's, and I had to tell her, like, this is like crack cocaine. Like when you don't want to put it down. You know what? I sometimes I got to tell her, put the pipe down. Come on, we got to go out or we got to go do something. And you just don't want to because you're just so engrossed in. And she says it's bittersweet, right? It's like you go through all this pain to get something to work, but you want that high of seeing it work. So you just kind of fight through it, right?
I do
So
think it
it's like that
attracts
same thing.
also a certain personality type, and so I agree with you actually more than I wish was true. Yeah.
I've learned, and I even told her, I said, I've been doing this for over 30 years. So I've learned it's taking me that long to really learn how to balance that feeling and the desire to be on that computer with everything else. I fight in the evening to not open up the laptop. Like it's a fight, but I've learned how to do it. And she's just kind of starting out. Do you have that kind of same thing right now where you're fighting to just say, look, I got to do something other than tech?
So that's probably the other thing I was always interested in, which was electronics. And I think for many years, my love for electronics was like a lot stronger than computers simply because of the access. Computers were just hard to access as a kid. Um, and I think recently I've sort of picked that back up again. So I have been building things, soldering. I know US, you call it soldering, but soldering things around. And so I think in some ways it's gotten easier, but then there is also this realization that sometimes the hard problems unfortunately do get cracked in that sort of obsessive environment. As much as I think the balance is hard to achieve day by day. So I definitely go through phases where I'm obsessively programming, and then there are times where I want to get to programming. I think right now I sort of want to get into that flow, and then I just keep getting interrupted for one reason or the other. So I feel like my life sort of has naturally reached that balance. But if I was a full time programmer, I think it would be a little bit more of a struggle, perhaps.
I want to get back to the grade school for a second, but I when I hear these types of things, I'm always reminded that it's never about not having time to do things. It's about not having the attention.
Absolutely.
And so to not beat yourself up over the things you just don't have the attention to do right now. Like it's okay. I've heard people for decades saying, "Oh, I really want to do this and I really want to do that." And I'd have to stop and say, if you really wanted to do that,
Sure.
I mean, if you really wanted to put your attention to that, you'd be doing it. So stop lying to yourself. It's obviously that's you really don't want to do that, right? It's very rarely a situation of time. You will make time for the things you want to do.
I think especially true for parents. I don't have kids, obviously, but I've heard and I've seen friends around, and I think especially when you have kids, you pretty much do learn to like create time for things you right. You're absolutely right. I think human beings are remarkable at getting things done that they truly desire and want, and also remarkable at like not getting done what they know and deep in their heart they don't want.
Right, exactly. All right. So when you enter those last 4 years of grade school, now we're talking probably somewhere around 14 through 17, 18. What's going on there with school? Like, what are your favorite subjects? Are you still thinking like I want to be engineering and soldering stuff? Are you thinking about programming? Are you thinking about something completely different that we haven't even talked about yet?
I think the general state of mind at the point was something completely different, which was I grew up in sort of this environment where my dad worked for the Indian Railway, and we lived in the railway sort of like colony, they called it, or railway accommodation, provided accommodations. So the whole environment was very much, the Indian Railway as the largest employer in India and probably one of the largest in the world. And obviously, so in that world there were like sort of levels which were very aspirational for my parents, and they took a lot of pride in showing me that I can aspire to those. So that's sort of like the general thing that was going on. I was always a tinkerer. I loved building things. I didn't think much of it. But then I remember I ended up through one of these like computer. I had a teacher who sort of gave me some more access to a computer system because he saw something I built, and through that I ended up uh, visiting one of these technology institutes in India around the 2 years before graduating from high school, and just seeing how remarkably different that world was and how much more kind of intellectual, and that just like rewired my brain. And in an instant I knew, okay, this is what I want to be in this place. I didn't know what they did there. I had no idea what engineering was, what you could do there. That's where I actually saw my first supercomputer back in 1998, like in this massive like glass lab you could just watch from outside. It was one of the few India had, and it was just like this turning point for
So
me.
let
Yeah.
me. I'm curious then that your parents, were they in intellectual roles with the railroad, or were they in sort of labor manual, say labor roles with the
No,
railroad?
my dad was in
Where were
more of an engineering, but sort of like quality assurance and making sure that everything is being done properly to the spec. So definitely more engineering centric. I don't know if he started in something different, but I believe he started in that and then kept climbing his way up. My mom was an educator for all her life. She is an educator essentially, even now in a way. And she did, in fact, even a PhD in economics. So she was intellectual in that way. She didn't work at the railway, but she was always like teaching or managing a school.
Did you ever think I'm did your mom just recently get the PhD, or did she have it when you were in high school? Was that something that they had talked about, you just going higher and higher education? Was that their kind of focus and push for you?
She already had it, I think, when or she wrapped it up around the time I was being born. So yeah, I always knew my mom had it, but I think it was a very different time where women had fewer opportunities or even the sort of like value system to prioritize a career, and so she always, I think, prioritized her career based on what worked best for the family. So she didn't talk much about her PhD a lot, but I knew she had it. I knew she was like, and my dad were both like pretty capable, but were, were sort of like doing the best with the opportunities they had and the stability they needed. My mom didn't talk so much about like a higher education, but one thing she was always very particular about was, in India at least we use this word. I don't know, did you use it in the US, called the middle class, the rise of the middle class, where
Yeah, I would have considered myself middle class growing up in a neighborhood that was probably, I would say we were on the very low end of middle class, or we were lucky enough to be on the edge of a community that was, say, higher class. So a lot of people around me had things I was never ever going to have in my life, which sometimes is like it hurts, right? But other times, at least, I felt like I'm in a good place. Like I'm kind of lucky to be here, right? Even though I'm not going to have those sneakers and those clothes and those opportunities. So
I
yeah,
think
I would
very
say I was
similar.
middle
Yeah,
class.
exactly. So, in fact, I even have a theory now, which is I think most people who call themselves middle class were actually being generous, and they were really low middle class, and they just didn't want to believe that or feel that or think that at the time. So yeah, I'd say very similar upbringing for me as well. So she was very particular that she wanted me to sort of like move a few more planes up, like she would call it, like leaving the middle class. So I remember like hearing that phrase constantly growing up, that you have to leave the middle class. And I think like it took me a very long time to also like realize that, okay, I've left it and I can drop that now, that, and I can operate from a different place.
I with my dad, I kind of figured two things out there. One, I never wanted anything I needed, right? Regardless of the amount of income they had. And I never wanted anything we needed, which I think is great, right? Like the moments that you start wanting things that you absolutely need, food, clothing, shelter, like real necessities, that's when things get really complicated. But I think the other thing is, as my dad got older, my dad wanted to be a musician. So just a little, he had a job at Grumman Aerospace, and he worked there for 25 years, but he never took promotions. All his friends became senior VPs. All the people that he knew that he started with became senior VPs. He never wanted it because he was a musician and he wanted to be able to play his music, whether that was bars or weddings and all of that. So I think at the top line, I think the best year he ever had salary, my mom didn't work, was like 50,000 a year, living in New York, Long Island. All right. So that's why I'm saying, low middle class, right? But I never wanted anything we needed. We got everything we needed. But he had said to me one time, that, Bill, I never went hungry. I always had a bed to sleep in, and I always had a roof over my head, and I always had clothing. And there's a part of me that's constantly, even today, fearful that I'm not going to have a bed to sleep in tomorrow. I'm not going to have a house. I'm not going to have food. I don't know why, but I have these fears, and I have to go back to my dad saying that, these things never happened to me. And you're much well off than I was ever, Bill. So why do you think these things are going to happen to you, right? And that's kind of always grounded me. I don't know does that kind of sharing that story with you. You have maybe some of the same thoughts.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for sharing. I mean, I know it's very personal as well, and it is pretty remarkable that your dad prioritized being a playing musician, because that takes a lot of courage, and I think it's hard to make a contrarian choice when nobody else around you is making. And I think I relate in that sense, that I think my mom made some contrarian choices about my education, and I definitely, on the contrary, though, grew up for one reason or the other, like very dissatisfied with what, not because of the things, but more because of, I think, just um, the struggle for transportation and things like, which is more India than anything else, really. So I sort of have always had a persistent, healthy amount of anxiety for making things better, and or like having a better lifestyle or something. And so I did have that, where I think when I first started making money as an entrepreneur, it took me many years to sort of drop that anxiety, that what if I couldn't make rent next month. But I eased into it pretty quickly after that, and I think that sort of little bit of that restlessness and anxiety will never like really go away, and I think now I see it as a positive thing. So I don't know if I actually answered your question, but yeah.
No, you did. And that brought up, I guess, one other thing I should share. Like I have in my first marriage, I have 5 kids.
Right.
Right. And I had my first kid when I was 26. So I think some of the anxiety and fear I have wasn't me
Sure.
being homeless and shirtless or whatever. I live in the street. It was having 5 kids that I couldn't allow that to happen to. That's what drove everything. Like I'd rather just sit at home, trust me. Like, but I'd wake up every day and say, you have a responsibility here, but you can't just do what you want sometimes. You got to just kind of. So I think a lot of that sort of anxiety and fear came from not from my own personal being, but uh, because of the kids, right? Which has helped me, I think, also be a better person and grow both in life, career, all that kind of stuff. And now I got married again and added 2 more kids. So now I say 7 kids I'm managing at this point,
Yeah, no,
right? But
that's a
that's
lot of
grounded me. That made me grow up a little bit.
responsibility as growth fuel, for sure.
Plus, in the first marriage, my ex liked cats, so there were 4 cats and then a dog, and I'm always like, "Yeah, I'm tired of just having to keep people alive," or tired. Like I do, I wake up, I'm like, I'm just tired of keeping things
Sure.
alive, right? And then when my son complains, I'm like, what are you complaining about? You don't have to keep anything alive right now except yourself,
But he
right?
doesn't
Like,
know any better.
but that's not fair. That's not fair. Exactly. He doesn't know any better, right? But sometimes you're tired too,
Sure.
and you just say that dumb
No,
thing
no, no,
you don't want to
absolutely. I mean,
say.
and I didn't
But
mean it like that. I mean, I sometimes I think about it. I actually do have 2 cats, and uh, sometimes I think I'm like, wow, boy, am I glad that I just have cats and I don't have to worry about making them into functioning human beings or something. Because if I treated my children like this, I treat my cats pretty well. But I think you know what I mean. Like sometimes there'll be days where I'll be working, like we talked about, in this like state where I completely forget about the world, and I have feeders and everything, and I know. And then suddenly I'd be like, wow, I haven't actually interacted with my cats for like a few days or something. And I can't imagine, like, if I had a kid, if that would be acceptable.
yeah, that's not going to fly at all. They're going to bug you every 10 minutes too. The 11-year-old is brilliant to just come out of a room and just start talking. Like you're in the middle of watching a program or you're in the middle of a conversation and she'll just start talking and you have to shut everything off because she's the 11-year-old and you don't want to, right? You just got to give her your attention and then she'll walk away in 2 minutes and then you could kind of go back to your life. So, but that takes time and practice. Okay, look, I love these conversations because you sidetrack, but I'm going to pull us back in here. So, as you're finishing high school now, you're finishing up high school, you had that opportunity to see that facility with the computers and all that. What are you thinking as you're finishing up high school, what your next step is going to be and what you're going to study?
So once I knew that I want to be part of that institute, it was actually very obvious what the next step was, because in India, at least, uh, there's very few, let's say, places available for you to go into engineering, and far too many people who want that. So for everything, there is an exam. We call them competitive exams. India is very competitive in general. This one is one of the most competitive exams in India for getting into this kind of college. And so I basically, for the next 3 years, I mean, from my class 10th, which is 2 years before high school for you in the US, basically I had spent almost like 80% of my time the next 3 years just prepping for exams to get into that school. And I had to put everything else aside, all my electronics, all my computer science, all my love for everything. And when I graduated, I wrote the exam. I didn't really make it in, so that added another year. So that's why 3 years. And then I finally made it in. And so my life for the next 3 years was just that. And there was no other. Towards the end of it, I think I started getting distracted a bit, but my parents shut it down pretty quickly.
Here at Ardan Labs, we believe in empowering companies to reach their full potential through innovative technology solutions. Trusted by small startups and Fortune 500 companies alike, we specialize in high-performance software consulting, training, staffing, development, and now AI. With over 14 years of experience, Ardan Labs has trained over 30,000 engineers and served over 1,000 companies worldwide. Whether you're mastering Go, Rust, Kubernetes, Terraform, or blockchain, we're your strategic partner for performance-grade solutions. Let's elevate your tech journey together. Reach out to Ardan Labs today.
So a couple things here, because that's amazing to me. You're not really at around that age 15. You're not mature enough yet to just, at least I know I wasn't, to just say this is absolutely what I want. I'm going to dedicate. And it's easy to say that in the first 30, 45 days, right? But then something always comes up. But you really dedicated yourself to that sort of cause. I'm curious how you felt when you took the exam the first time and didn't pass. Did you just feel like you wasted 3 years of your life, or was it just another challenge?
So there's two parts to that, you know, question or the answer. One is like in general in India, it's pretty much. A lot of people know they want to go into engineering or whatever. At least back in the day. So I think from that perspective, maybe I knew I have to do some kind of an engineering thing. But in particular, like trying to get into this university, like I knew it was very competitive. But I also really wanted to get in, and I almost like never keep a backup plan. For some reason or the other, my brain just works better that way. So my father would always like insist that I write some other exams, and I would like reluctantly do it for him. But surprisingly enough, those were always like the easier ones, and I never made it through any of them, even when I finally made it through this much harder one. So it's just how my brain functions. So no, I was very singularly focused. I did actually love the, they test you in physics and maths and chemistry, and I think I was pretty interested in those subjects, most of them at least. And so it was not a drag or a chore. I think I have that sort of ADHD brain, and it just the hyper focus takes over. The first time I wrote it after 2 years of prep, I didn't make it in, but somehow I felt like I got a first-hand experience of like what it feels like to write that exam. And it's very common. Like in the year I got into that college, there were people in my batch who had written it 5 or 6 times actually. To the point where now
Okay.
they actually don't
All
allow you
right.
to write it more than 2 times, because too many people were doing that and just putting their life on hold. So it was pretty common. But one thing that surprised me was just how much more intuitively I could like feel the exam now. And then I just became like almost stupidly confident that I'll be able to do it the next time. And then I did do it, because I think somehow it wasn't the skill set, but just managing perhaps the few hours of sitting through that exam with that pressure that I couldn't have practiced otherwise, I think. Yeah.
When you're now in this university, is this a 3 or 4 year program like you would see in an
Yeah, it's a four
undergraduate
years.
degree? And is the focus so this is a 4 year program, you'll end it with an undergraduate degree, and what were you thinking major-wise? Was this double E? Was it computer
So, I
science?
mean,
What were
it's
you kinda
never
focused
like,
on?
again, it's not binary that you get in or you don't. Like, they rank you even in the exam. And I think you probably have a lot of listeners from India, and they know how this whole system works. And this university is pretty popular. I mean, I'm reluctant to say its name because then people see you a different way and assume many things about you. But it's called the IIT, the Indian Institute of Technology. It's actually very popular even in the US. So I think like Sundar Pichai and a lot of these people went to one or the other IITs, and uh, but then, even when you get into the exam, like you're ranked. So, if you wanted to study computer science in one of the five established IITs at the time, mine was the sixth one. You had to be in like top 200 or something, like of the 150,000
Mm.
people who wrote that exam with me. And unfortunately, I was only 965. I remember it that distinctly. One of the very few things from that era because I was disappointed. It's so ridiculous looking back that being in the top 1,000.
Right, you were 900 out of
Right.
150,000.
But I couldn't get computer
That's
science in
wild.
any place in any place actually. Yeah. So I chose electronics, and eventually I loved it. But at the time, it definitely felt, and even electronics I could get in one of the newer institutions because it was a bit farther off. It wasn't as established yet. Like, that's just how crazy it all sounds now and is actually.
No, because I'm guessing there's only so many seats and everybody
Exactly.
wants
Yeah.
the computer science seats. So it would make sense that there isn't room for 900 people. I mean, that makes sense. But I love what you just said, right? Like I've heard this story a couple times in the show, not I mean with other guests, where these opportunities arise in fields that are new or the schools experimenting with another program and they're able to kind of get into some cutting edge stuff that normally you would never be able to get in today unless you were in that top 100. But and it sounds like that's what you said. You were able to kind of get into this sort of electronics program because it was new and nobody knew enough to like say
I
that's
think
where we
the
should be.
electronics program itself was a little bit new because so at the time there were like six institutions in different parts of the country. So you could go to any one of them based on what you get at which place. So I couldn't have gotten electronics either in other places, but they all had electrical engineering. So yeah, my institute was new. They did have this sort of electronics engineering, which was a newer thing, but they also had layered on communications engineering on it. So they would teach us about wireless communication and things like that. And but until you said this, it's actually something I hadn't thought about. That yeah, a lot of my life has been about finding these sort of like overlooked things. I have to be very honest. I mean, I think I went in feeling a little bit disappointed. So I think I acted from that place for like a year or so until I truly started appreciating what I had. But eventually, yeah, I did love electronics a lot more.
So then during this 4 year program, what are they overall, right? At a macro level, what are they training or teaching you to be able to do? Like, what were the jobs that you were going to be able to be considered for coming out of this particular program? You're not building circuits and cards, are
Actually,
you?
we were. I mean, and we certainly could have, and I was pretty good at it, and I loved it a lot too. So the first year was common for all engineering disciplines, and they pretty much teach you again what you have just like demonstrated so much of your ability on because they think you're still not good enough. It's just I think people from my college are gonna hate me for saying all these things, but like it's one perspective at least. So I was pretty disappointed about that too. I was like, why are we learning all these pulleys and chemical reactions again? So the first year was just a lot of that, but with a lot more like labs, I'd say. So there was a lot more of the they had half day of like actual theory and the other half day of doing labs, hands on. Yeah, and
Hands on.
everything
Yeah.
counted. Like, it was again the spirit of competition only intensified. So that was the first year. There was one computer science course in that first year for us, which was C programming language. CS 101. And from the second year, it got more specialized. We still had one computer science course, which was CS 201 data structures and algorithms. But other than that, yeah, we started specializing in electronics, and we did very little electrical engineering, things like motor design and AC and all that. But then we started specializing in chips and transistors and resistors and building circuits. And I mean, that stuff is also quite and was very exciting back in the day. Yeah.
And a lot of that educate this is I think I talked about this with my last guest is that I was talking to Anne, actually Anne, we talked about because she had a also like an electrical engineering background. Um, that stuff you learned is still very, very relevant to electrical engineering today. Unlike if you were learning programming languages back then, those languages may not be. So I always say that I have a computer science degree, but the what I got mostly out of it wasn't programming in C and that stuff. It was problem solving, learning how to take a problem that I'd never seen before and find the solution. I think that was the best part of my education because any tech I was working on in 1988 is no longer valid, right? But anything you learn from electrical engineering, like that's physics. That's like that stuff doesn't change at all, even today, right? So if you decide to jump back into hardware, whatever it is, all of that knowledge applies. Is that
I'd
true?
say, I mean, a lot of it applies. A lot of it is not used as much because of, I think, things like how much software has taken over the hardware world, like in terms of Arduino or Raspberry Pi, where it's easier to just put a microchip now and program it, right? Like, so not in that sense. But if you were designing, let's say, the Raspberry Pi itself, or, but even that, however, there is this one domain, which is what I'm doing now for fun on the side, is, I guess, just audio engineering, like being an audiophile or building like amplifiers or things like that, where I think there is almost this remarkable nostalgia for tubes. And in fact, even like stuff that I didn't even study in my days because it was already considered outdated. So I think like for a love of that sort of stuff, or I would say the audio domain will forever live on, and I'm glad in some ways. For the other stuff, it's strange because I went in wanting to do more computer science, but then fell in love with electronics and learned to appreciate it and what challenges it brought to the table and wireless communication. But then I felt, at least in India, it was very hard to find jobs that like really lived up to what you could really do. I think most of the jobs were actually in embedded systems. So you were working with hardware, but more like writing MP3 decoders or things like that. And then there was this lull, I think, until I wish like Arduino had come out back around then things would have been very different. So it was very hard to do a startup in hardware. And so I feel like I kind of couldn't really leverage it. And then I had to make a switch to software after graduation, which was very painful at the time. Like it just felt like leaving a lot of like love and learning behind.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because when you graduate now with your electronics degree, is the decision to go into the job market or is the decision to get more education?
I, again, probably by the nature of the university I was at, it almost nobody talked about getting a job. And even when people got a job, it was not something people talked a lot about. Everybody knew they would almost get a job, which sounds very arrogant, but I think the reason everybody would get a job would be because everybody gets hired eventually in software anyway. That was already a trend back in 2005 when I graduated. um, I did find like supposedly a job in my domain, which was working at Samsung or something like that, where you're doing software but for hardware. And then I like quit that to join a smaller company. But yeah, most of the focus was on either doing some kind of research, or some people be back in the day just like knew the next obvious step was to do an MBA, like like this ladder which was already laid out for you. I was very interested in research. I in fact even published 4 IEEE papers when I was in my undergrad, which was pretty like uncommon for then. And I applied. I actually got into Penn State in the US for a PhD. And but somehow I didn't get any financial aid even for the first year, and I couldn't really make it through. So I feel like I always reluctantly go into things and then like end up just staying there.
But
So
did you end up
make what
going to
you
Penn
want of
State,
that.
or you didn't have the
I
means, so you
couldn't,
couldn't
no,
go?
because we didn't have the means, and many people don't. And it was very well known by the time that you could just get there somehow, and then you'll get a scholarship of some kind. You'll figure it out. I think the problem was we just weren't savvy enough as a family to like figure out how to like get the visa by, showing sufficient means or whatever. So we didn't really play the system well, and I didn't go.
So then you talked about Samsung. Is that the first job you kind of took after university? Is that is that what you did in 2005, 2006?
So I had a few offers. I mean, because I guess I was just so casual about it. I don't know what it was, but for a strange reason, I had like two or three different offers. One was, in fact, a motorbike manufacturer in India, very well known one. They invited me to their campus to check it out, and I knew immediately that, oh, I can do that. The work was fascinating, like electronics for, but they were trying to like, I understand why, but they were trying to create this environment of like a factory, even for everybody's equal and sort of that thing. And so they imposed all of those factory restrictions on people in software. Like you couldn't bring in a phone, you couldn't access the internet, so I just like instantly knew, okay, that's ruled out. I did join Samsung. I was always a terrible employee. I remember they sort of put us into a hotel in India. We say they put us in, but whatever they got us a hotel and they had like six people there. And I went to the HR and said, "This is not very pleasant." And they said, "Oh, you really have very high expectations of this job." And I said, "That's it for you guys." And I quit
Oh
that
my
in
goodness.
one day. Oh my gosh, I was terrible. Yeah. But
So then so you did that one day, we're done. So tell me about that first job then. Like where do you that first job you land that you're starting to get some experience, and what is the job about?
so I also had a third offer at the time, and most of these companies are in Bangalore, so it was not that hard to go to them and say, hey, look, I didn't join you guys, but I'm here if you want me now. And that was in hardware, like they were building optical network switches for running very high speed uh, mobile networks and things like that back in the day. And I joined them. I love the energy. It was a startup. It is actually founded by another graduate of the IIT system who's quite well known in the US, like Deshpande. I don't remember his first name, but he's on the board of MIT or something. So I think there was this sort of like semi academic, semi commercializing a technology, but being very cutting edge for its time, energy, lots of young people figuring things out. So I love the energy, and I just think that they hired us at a time where they didn't know what to do with us. So they just kept giving me things that I just couldn't, get excited about. And I did. I met some cool people. I wrote some Python or things like that, and after a few months, I quit that as well. And yeah, I have a very very bad track record of the couple of years I worked for other people.
I'm not going to call it a bad track record because I've learned through this podcast that saying no to something that's just not working out, leaving a job even 2 months later, if it's not the right fit, is actually, I think, a better decision than if you can afford to. Like I could never have afforded that. I had 5 kids. I needed a paycheck to keep coming in. So
Sure.
I wouldn't be able to just quit without another paycheck coming in. But at the same time, getting out of that situation, if it's not good for you, I think is better than staying in. Like this, I, before I started this podcast, I would have told you stay at every job for at least 2 years and keep your resume clean.
Right.
Not anymore. I've now learned quite the opposite. But I don't care if you quit a job after 2 months, if it's you're leaving for the right reason. It's just the wrong fit for you. Get out and find something that's the right fit, even if that takes 7 jobs. Like I have a completely different attitude after talking to people.
I agree. Actually, I mean, coming to think of it, I don't know why I kept, qualifying it like that. I guess because I don't want to say that whatever. Like, I think I just want to qualify that Yeah, it worked out for me. It was a little bit challenging because I really did want to find something that was engaging, and I finally joined this company that said, "Hey, let's build a wireless chip, and we'll very ambitious." But I think it was too ambitious for them. They didn't really know what they were signing up for. So after a few months of that, they sort of said, "Oh my gosh, this is taking a lot longer than we thought. So let's just have you write MP3 decoders again." So that was the end of that career. But I agree with you, and I think at least as a company, the last thing you want to also do, which I learned firsthand, was you don't want to shame people into staying at your company. Like I was definitely, I think, I was like shamed a little bit at each job, saying, "Oh, you want too much. Oh, you just don't like solving hard problems." Or, and I feel like those are not the things that you want to tell people. Life is long, so you should definitely quit. Also, if you're an employer, I think just be nice to people. If they're not a good fit in your company, just let them go and wish them well.
The world is too small to not be nice to everybody. And I try to tell everybody too, everybody you meet on the way up, you're going to meet on the way down. So
Oh
if
yeah,
you're going to
sure.
be an asshole to everybody on the way up, what do you think's going to happen when when you're on the way? Like nobody's at the top forever. I don't care who you are, celebrity, whatever it is, you're not on the top forever. So
Especially in this industry, you just have no idea which intern will go on to like create the next OpenAI, or it happens all the time. Like I've painfully learned it myself. Like absolutely.
I mean, I love helping people, and I try to give my time everywhere. But kind of like a joke that's in my head sometimes is that at some point I'm going to be 70 years old, and if I still need a job when I'm 70, maybe one of these people I was nice to will let me hand me a broom. I don't mind mopping the floors at night. I need an income, so maybe one of these people will be nice to me when I'm 70 and hand me a broom, and I'll have work,
I'm
right?
sure there'll be more than a few. Yeah, for
But
you.
and I have that in the back of my head sometimes, you know. Again, isn't it? I'm always worried about making sure that I've got some sort of income coming in because of the kids, you know. So I'm thinking
Sure.
about that all the time. Okay, so you leave that job. Um, so what happens? Where when do you find that job, or even better, when do you decide that I can't be an employee? I need to be an entrepreneur, and I'm gonna try to go in that direction.
I finally found a job that I really did love and stayed at for about a year. So that was like the longest stint and the last one that I ever had as a full time employee. And this was another company that was building a wireless chipset, but they had the funding and they had the chipset for one of those new 8 at the time 802.11b or something, when 802 was like almost just out of draft. So, but it was writing firmware with a very small team and a very waterfall like thing. So I remember like we spent 3 months writing the specification with each bit how it be programmed. So I think I appreciated that about the job, where it showed me a lot of this rigor, even at the previous one. So I felt like I learned some of those things. But then again, like startups, and they ran out of money, they couldn't continue the project, and they just wanted to shuffle things around. And once again, I found myself sort of just bored. And that's when I started writing, I think, things for the web, just as a something to build. And I think I just felt so empowered with the idea of being able to put something out there, iterate so quickly, see the results, and just do it all by yourself. That was the end of, I think, corporate life for me from that point on.
And you would never get that kind of feedback loop on hardware anyway, right? Because just the manufacturing of it alone would take time.
I think that's true. At least that was definitely true back in the day. But you could get it, for example, in firmware or something like this, right? Another like thing that I very distinctly remember, one of the few experiences, is we were writing this, like how all these network routers or come with a little web interface where you can log in and configure it. So that was actually my very first web experience, was through that job. In a way, I had never thought about it again. But there was this thing called CGIC, which was like writing in C, something with CGI, whatever, and it would generate a web page back and send it back. So it was like a very little web runtime embedded into this small device on the hardware. And it was a tiny web server, and the interface to it was like doing fprintf or something like that. So you wrote every line of code you wanted in html in that. So you would write
You
fprintf,
oh
like
my
seriously, like
goodness.
crazy.
Yeah, no
Yeah,
templates that you filled in. You literally wrote out the HTML as a
exactly.
concatenating
And
a string.
yeah, like one line out. So you're basically writing like these files made of like printf statements, right? Like at least that's how it had already been written, like that, right? And they would, the next thing will blow your mind, Bill. I kid you not. Like, tell me if I've never told this story to many people actually, because I don't want to like, say, hey, look at, but they would write JavaScript files also like that. So they would write static files like that, like things
Wow.
that were not dynamic. And I remember going into a meeting and telling them, hey, look, you can just include a static file. And I remember we were like the India team, there was a US team, but it didn't matter. Like I remember hearing on the, I said this idea, I thought, wow, they were going to be like so thrilled, saying, wow, you saved us so much time. And the answer comes back. I will never forget it. The time to make those kind of decision was many months ago.
Wow. No
And that was
refactoring.
the end of it.
No
Right.
refactoring, no improvement.
No improvement in like changing from like printing the file to just putting a static file and like printing an import.
Wow.
Because like they didn't care, they didn't trust anybody. They were like, it's working, let it work. And I think so it showed me like just how backwards they were about all that stuff. And it also like I think by that time it had introduced me to web, so I started building things on my own, and I just yeah, I don't know how we got here, but
What year is that? Is this like now 2008? Something around 2009,
yeah,
2000?
pretty, yeah, very precisely. It is actually 2007. It was late 2007. Yeah.
Okay.
So
So
like yeah, this had no place basically in any decent engineering culture where people even trusted each other. Yeah.
so when you leave that job, what are you now thinking? You're thinking, I really like the web. I like that sort of instant feedback. Are you starting to think about being an entrepreneur at that point, building product?
So the reason I left that job was because I had already built my first product, which was this music sharing app called Musiboo, and I was very inspired by Flickr at the time as a budding photographer. And I also always wanted to learn music, so I felt, why does this not exist for music? A community like that, not just a place to upload your MP3, even if you have played it. And so I called it Musiboo. I worked with somebody on it, and we put it up there. I was the only programmer, and since we were part of this like large company, we told a few people, and then somebody uploaded their song, and then 2 or 3 days later we already had like 20 or 30 uploads from people we had never even met. And that was like you said, right, like that was like that crack cocaine. That was just this, I was hooked. And
Yeah.
we were not making any money. We were growing actually well, not by Facebook standards or anything, but it was, you could tell people cared about it, like because it had that element of community. So I think like that was sort of coupled with these other things, just this call to go full time. There was no plan really. And in fact, after going full time, I had to still do a bunch of consulting work on the side. And I
Sure. I mean, you
remember
had to
like
pay
giving one or two
bills.
inter. Yeah,
Yeah, you had to pay bills. You had rent or something,
right.
right? Like you needed money. So you decided I'm going to go full time on this, but I'm going to have to take some consulting work to bring in enough money to support myself.
That's exactly correct. I thought we can make more revenue pretty quickly, but that didn't pan out, obviously, because we were not very savvy. I think that was the time in India where most people didn't know that if they had a web property, what could they do with it other than the obvious, which is putting AdSense or Google Ads on it, or selling listings to equipment manufacturers or like things like that. So
But it's
yeah, I had to pick up
super,
work.
super hard once you give free access to start asking for money, right?
Sure.
It's just super hard to do that, especially on these social sites, right? I mean, Facebook and Twitter are not making really money on subscriptions, right? They're still making it on ads. So I give Twitter, everybody's like, Bill, why are you giving Twitter $8 a month or bucks a month? I'm doing it mainly for the developers that work on that product. Like it's my way of saying to the developers, I love what you're doing and I'm going to support the work that you're doing. Even if somebody says, well, Bill, they're already making, I don't care. That's my $12 a month. I pretend that I'm paying for developer time because I know how hard it is to build product
Yeah.
and how hard it is to get the dollar. So I have no problem paying that. But it is incredibly hard, especially even now today, to put something out there that isn't free.
Yeah, and I don't know if free was the problem, but just to circle back, I'm kind of like you as well, where I think because maybe we make our money on the internet and we know what goes into it, we are more eager to pay for things we actually use. I pay for almost everything I use, even if I don't have to. I'm the same way. And I don't think the free was the problem there. We did actually monetize with some subscriptions, and we had enough users who cared about like higher sound quality uploads and things like that. And we started making at its peak a few $1,000s a month, which was a lot of money in India back then. Like, I could live in $500 a month. Pretty amazing. Not amazing, but whatever, like at least a materially very comfortable life. But it wasn't predictable. It wasn't growing predictably. So those things remained. Yeah, for sure.
So then what happens there? Because you have your first sort of stint in being an entrepreneur. You built a product that people wanted to use. You worked hard towards growth. You still had to do consulting on the side. Even when I started this business I'm in now, the Arden business, God knows how many hours I worked just to keep enough money coming in to grow, right? I mean, people sometimes don't realize that. And even on my first business that failed, at some point had to stop taking salary on the first business, but I had to keep working on the product in the hopes that we would get out of whatever that lull was. And I was working two jobs essentially, right? For a year. So I don't know how many people actually realize how much work goes in, right? Because you're basically working two jobs at that point, one to bring some money in and one to build the product out. But I guess you decided at some point this wasn't gonna work anymore. So how does that all happen? Do you and your sort of business partner decide we're gonna shut it down?
So we didn't shut it down. I think I again, like I said, like I get restless with things pretty quickly. Even though in retrospect I should have gotten even more quickly. So I think I just kept learning more about programming. I got introduced to Ruby on Rails. That's how I built this one, and I just felt that okay, I can build so much better. I do have skill set in writing and things like that, and I could see software as a service was starting to pick up and revenues were more predictable, and it just made sense to switch to something like that. So that was like the last B2C thing I ever really built, at least seriously. And I switched over to B2B SaaS more as a pragmatic choice. And honestly, it worked out really well for all those reasons. I think one thing I wonder if you have felt this is like when I was doing the first one, like I said, I was happy to have $500 a month, and then in some strange way, I feel like I made 500 or a few thousand or something, right? Like, and then with this, I wanted to make like 10, 20, 30K, and then I ended up making that. And I feel like I had like a growth in my skill set, but also my ambition and also my sort of permission or the self worth to say I can do better, make more, have more impact through these startups. So for me, these journeys were always like about all those two or three dimensions, um, growing on all two or three of them. Yeah.
But it sounds like this first business was working. You were making revenue. You were growing revenue every year. You saw demand go up. I didn't have that on my first business, and I actually took a pay cut to start the first business and ate through all my savings within 3 or 4 years and everybody who had a failed business will say, I should have gotten out earlier. I'm going to say that too, right? You just don't want to give up on it because you're so pot committed. You want to try one more week. You want to try one more month. I mean, I think that's fair. As you learn now, and I think I had this conversation with you. Like I was told most people's third business tend to be the most successful because they've learned enough in the first two failed businesses. But you had a business that was actually working, it was growing. You have revenue, you had revenue growth. So I'm kind of confused as to why you moved on from that business?
It was growing. One, it was very ad driven again, right? Like the split was 50-50. I remember our best month while I was working on it, it made $3,000, which was pretty good for its time. But it was also very obvious that it wasn't going to, like, be enough to hire other programmers if I wanted to work with other people, or grow predictably. I also think I got disillusioned with just serving musicians. I think they're wonderful people, but they're themselves sort of like struggling with how to make money off it. And there was a sense that somehow we should help them make money. And I think I just didn't understand enough about the music industry. It was also a litigation prone. Overall, it just didn't feel sort of worth the hassle to me. I'm very pragmatic in that way. I mean, I do love things, but I don't love unnecessarily suffering. Like, I think life has plenty of legitimate suffering already. So it was just one of those pragmatic choices where I felt, yeah, I would rather work on software as a service where I can relate better to my customers. I can build more predictable revenue. Like, I didn't have to start from scratch each month. Like, if you're paying for music, discretionary expense, you can stop. As a business, you can't just stop. um, so yeah, many
But what
factors
was
like
the
that.
what was the idea now for the next product or business? Like, okay, software as a service, but what was the service that you were? Was it still the platform you built, but as a service, or was it a different sort of business?
One of the things that we kept, because we did eventually grow for the B2C business to about 500,000 users or so, we had a bunch of customer support to do. And so we couldn't do it in Gmail at the point. And back in the day, I don't know if you remember, we had like things like fog bugs and uh, you know uh, RT and things like that, which, like, I mean, they were sophisticated technically but just terrible to use. And I just wanted like a Gmail for support. And so that was sort of the idea we started working on, which was a customer support software that's very much like email. And even to your own customers, it feels like they're just exchanging emails with people. So that's what we started like building and selling. And it was a great idea. It still is, actually.
So what happened with that business? I love the story where I hear this a lot too. We had a consulting business, or we had this, and we realized we needed some tooling that didn't exist. So we built the tooling, and then we realized everybody needs this tooling, and a whole nother business sort of comes. I think Slack came out of that same sort of universe, and I've heard of other tech. So that's pretty cool. What happened with this tech then? What happened with that business?
So I think the idea came out of the other business, but there was really not much tech that I could use or wanted to use. Like, I didn't write very good code back in the day, or I also knew that code bases were a mess without test cases and things like that. So I think I started from scratch, technically speaking. The business is still healthy. The last I worked on it, it made 500,000 a year about 3-4 years back. A very small team runs it, uh, grows it, and has happy customers. I think it
What's
still
the
has a
name of the
lot of
product?
potential. Sorry,
What's the name of the product?
it's called Support Bee, like a
Support Bee.
honeybee, but supportbee.com.
So they're still operating, they're still running, but
Yeah, very
you
much
you
so.
walked away, and you walked away from that business.
I think I just needed a change, and again, I felt I want to be in a business that can grow faster. I felt it had kind of missed its moment. We were one of the very first to be sort of an email-like customer support. So I think now there are very good examples of that. Well-known ones like Help Scout or Front. We actually launched around at the same time as Help Scout. We had our moment of fame, like we were listed in Zendesk's S1 offering as a potential competitor. We had some very notable companies try us out in the early days, companies that you and I admire and love. So I think what I felt was, even if I could improve that business after many years, it would never get its fair share of visibility, people giving it a second chance, or the press writing about it. And again, like I said, I'm very pragmatic. I figured, if I want to grow something, I would rather than start again from scratch. And that was the right call. But yeah, the business is pretty solid, and it's a great business, actually.
There's this kind of saying I learned in the first business. It's burning territory. If you release something too early and it's all buggy or it's not working, you've burned that territory. getting somebody to come back and look at it a second time is incredibly hard. And if you're lucky enough to get them to look at it again and it fails for them again, then you're really in trouble. And I learned that in the first business. We released way too early. We didn't really do enough user studies on UIs, and we were inventing kind of new UIs that nobody was trained for, right? Like name the mistake, we made it. But we burned a lot of territory there that you were never going to get back. And it sounds a little bit like the same little thing. Like you burned enough territory where um, you weren't going to get the big customers back, and they had already moved on to other platforms.
That's actually true. I think most of our customers were coming to us because of the new paradigm. They just didn't want to work with like clunky software at the time, even though our interface wasn't by any modern standards like rave worthy. But back for the day, it was a single page application. We used Backbone JS or whatever. It worked well. It had keyboard shortcuts. But I think for us, the challenge was we couldn't keep up with their needs. So we would get a lot of interest because of our new paradigm. But then I think I was just not able to like really isolate what it is that we should focus on and what we should ignore. And to be very honest, I think a lot of it was because of my ADHD that I didn't understand back at the time. So I would get disillusioned every now and then, and I would like back off and then come back. And I think I like to say that the business did a lot more for me than I did for the business, and it's definitely one of the things I wish I had done better. But you're right.
But that is
Yeah.
it's a super product problem. If you talk to any product, I talked to Jeremy Sands. He did he did product for a long time on a big system. He ended up running product for a big company. Um, the problem is that you've got clients who all want something, but 90% of it is very specific to that client. And so trying to find that common denominator feature that works for everybody that you should put time in is incredibly difficult because you're basically, once you say no, you're walking away from revenue from a particular client. And I think too many early start companies want to say yes. Remember, we had a conversation about yes is forever. They 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 want to say yes to everything because they don't want to walk away from the revenue, and then it ends up creating either different versions of a product for different clients or a product that's not usable by anybody. It is incredibly hard problem. I don't have any answers to it other than saying no all the time. But no is only going to take you so far, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point where we were also very inspired by the philosophies of 37 signals or one of bootstrapping, then second of just saying no, which I mean, there's a lot of like merit to it. I think I finally formulated a theory for what happened and what happens, and I'm operating from it this time. So we'll see how it turns out. But one of the things that happens is something like support software, and especially if you have a new paradigm, it's easier, lower cost to train people because everybody knows email already. uh, you will start getting a lot of different customers, and for every sort of like new kind of software, you will very quickly start getting the mainstream customers who like you, but they want you to be like the mainstream. So they're not there for like what makes you very unique, and they will not put up with like a lot of friction. They want this integration, they want that, and there's many of them in fact. So it's not even so much, at least in our case, that it was one customer or specific things to specific customers, but sort of more like taking you towards the mainstream of customer support. But then the more you drift towards that, the harder it gets to sell because now you are being sold on a checklist, right? And but those people are very loud, and they're always like the bigger customer or something like that. And I think things that actually feel embarrassing, which is people using you with a lot of friction or things broken, you want to sort of like almost like feel happy moving away from that. Whereas now my theory is that you sort of want to serve the customers who know exactly everything that is out there, but they're using you for a very specific reason, and the reason that makes you very, very unique. And if tomorrow you didn't exist, and this is where all of that product market fit questionnaire comes in, if tomorrow you stop existing, they wouldn't just say, "Oh my, okay, let's move on to the next one," which is what a lot of these other customers would do. they would not be able to replace you easily. And that's the differentiation you want to kind of dig into and like build stronger and stronger. And we didn't. Like we start building more mainstream features like reporting, or but then you're building a suboptimal version of that because you're a smaller team and you're a, so you're moving away from your like strongest differentiator and you're moving into the sort of the completeness realm of like software. And I think that's the tension that is hard to manage, but it's different from, I think, doing like more custom work, if that makes sense.
It is. It's This is a really tough problem, and the way I've tried to rationalize it in my head is I have a vision for what I want to build, and I don't want to. I want to try to stay on that path the entire time. And if there's something that comes at me that can help the majority of the people that are using the software, then I'll consider maybe even prototype it and bring it in. But to really try to not become somebody else's product, to try to keep with the vision. It's the same thing with open source. I'm managing like I got knows for how many, 6, 7 different open source projects right now. And every once in a while, somebody comes to me and says they want to add this, and I have to say no, mainly because it's not part of my vision for what this software is or what it's trying to accomplish. And I love it. I thank you for sharing that with me. And I hate to say no to you, but it's not in line with my vision. And so I'm gonna have to say no. I mean, that's tough to do because then you have to trust yourself that saying no here isn't gonna affect your revenue a year from now. If anything, it will have improved it instead of hurt it. And that takes trust. It takes a lot of trust in you and your vision.
I think that's actually probably the most important point, and what makes it the hardest is that, especially one thing that I see a lot, there's a lot of like shaming that happens, at least in the bootstrapped or indie hacker circle, for programmers who want to stick to their vision and don't. Uh, which I get, like there is some merit to it, but I do think that, yeah, if you don't stick to it, then what you'll end up with is somebody else's vision that you don't believe in. You cannot drive it anymore. You surely can't sell it well. But I think a lot of it happens also over time. So it takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of conviction. And I think that is the permission you have to give yourself. And hopefully you have the resources. I think you have it now and I have it now to be able to play that game. But if I meet an entrepreneur now that I really like, and I try to like at least encourage them to like believe more in themselves, and that is why I think it is important, like you described precisely that way. Yeah,
Because in the first 5 years of a business, you have to try to bring as much revenue in one way or the other, whether that revenue is coming in through the product or like the same thing kind of we did, right? Like I got money coming in on the side, which makes it a lot easier for me to say no on the product because I don't need your revenue. I got enough revenue coming in the side, but I'm working 2 jobs. And that's maybe sustainable for 3 years, 5 tops, right? At some point you burn out. You got to choose one over the other. But having the side revenue makes it easier for you to say no. If all your revenue is basically coming in on the product, it it's just that much harder to say no. Now today, as you kind of alluded to, we've got good clients. If somebody comes in with a project and we just don't believe in the project or we think it's going to be a quality of life issue with this product or with this company, we're going to say no almost immediately. But that's a luxury. That's a privilege. But at the same time, we earned that privilege, right? We've been in business for 12 years
sure.
and we've survived a couple of really bad situations which would have taken us out of business. So I feel like when a person or a company gets to that point where they have that privilege or luxury to say no, it's earned because you don't have that at least in the first 2, 3, 4, 5 years.
I think you're absolutely right. One thing that I didn't talk about was, and this is not like a counterpoint, I think it just makes it more interesting. Con- I think the way you are consulting, you have two things at the same time. I always like did it so that I would like just like work a bunch for someone else for 3 4 months, and then the rest of the 8 months of the year I would just go on super low burn because I could afford to. I didn't have all the obligations, and then I would like run out of money, and then I would do it again. So I think I always like did it more like that. Um, I felt it might be interesting to mention that because it doesn't get talked about enough. It might help someone make that decision as well. But yeah, you're right. It's a
See, I
privilege.
like
Yeah,
I like that approach as an individual
right.
because what you can just say is, "I'm gonna shut down everything except this, generate enough cash that gets me the freedom to work on that." I think my entire problem, and I mentioned it before, is um, I'm always feel responsible for keeping other people alive, including the people who have chosen to work here at Arden, right? And we've got 40 something people here that get a paycheck. And I take it as a responsibility to make sure that I continue to do all the little things I'm doing every day to bring in another client, to keep the clients that we have, just so I can sleep at night knowing that this person's going to get another, a payroll is going to happen in 15 days, every 15 days. It's that
Absolutely.
same
Yeah.
sort of thing.
And healthcare and like so many
So
things in the US that you have to pay for, and office space. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very different setup. And I think also you just have I think you're also bringing a very valuable service. So it's not even just like that you're making money, right? Like you're educating people, and so it's so different for you than it was for me, at least back in the day. I actually never even grew any company of mine to that many number of people. I feel like that is something I've almost had a challenge with as well. Uh, but it's also a mind space thing. I think I just find it hard to like do justice to two things. So I don't want to be on client time and be thinking about my stuff, or vice versa. And I just want to maintain that. I think some people are better. I know some people are better at it. For me, that was always a challenge. I'm not saying necessarily it worked out. Like a lot of times, I would be full time on my thing and wasting time anyway. I think in the end, like you said, do what you can. I do still believe in it. Like if I were to go back in time, I think I would probably retrace a lot of the same steps. I would just probably surround myself with a few more ambitious people who said to me that, hey, you can actually make more money, you can do better, you can think bigger, you can make the jump, things like that. But other than that, yeah, we all have to and we should um, do what it takes to move into lives as an entrepreneur if that's what we desire. Any path that gets you there is the right path, really.
So we got about 7 minutes left, and I want to talk now about Magic Bell. So, from this product, you decided now that you wanted to start working on Magic Bell. Is that right? This is your third sort of product slash company that you've kind of started. Talk to me a little bit about that. I'm assuming then you started kind of on your own, and now you're starting to kind of slowly build a team around this idea. But talk to me a little bit about how Magic Bell got started and kind of how it gets to where it is today.
So it's a very personal story where I had to take a few years off between 2016 and 2020 to go through a gender transition. And that's actually something I started in Colombia. So I will always remember it as the place where I sort of started transitioning, living my life as, presenting as a woman and all of that. And it was a very isolating phase in many ways. I felt very disconnected from my own ambition, or I didn't know if my ambition was real or not. Or and my team was very supportive. Thankfully, the business was stable enough that I could afford to take that time off and still pay my bills and have the freedom. So, like I said, like that's why I will always feel the business did a lot more for me than I have done for it in some ways. Um, but as I was wrapping my transition up and coming back up into the world and plugging back in, I think I realized that I do actually enjoy building things. I am ambitious, but I also had this like new reason to want to prove myself. I think I just wanted to start afresh and start something as my new self and sort of grow it from scratch. I also, for one reason or the other, didn't want to bootstrap it this time. I felt very, I think in the early years of support, we losing customers because some very noteworthy customers because they weren't comfortable that we didn't have the money from investors, and rightfully so. Some of those things left a strong impression, or like posting a job post and people writing back saying this is a joke of a salary, which is just internet being mean. But I think for many reasons, I wanted to start afresh. I wanted to think bigger, more ambitious. I wanted to raise money for it. And I also just wanted to build something in the API engineering space. And so I started with somebody I had worked with at Support B. I started with them as a co founder, some other people helping me out. And then, since I knew that I wanted to do this path of raising money, and I was still an outsider to the world of venture capital, for me, the next obvious step was just getting into Y Combinator. And I'd applied before, but this time I think it was just like I said, right? Like if you really want something, you make it happen. And they liked me. They didn't like the idea as much. I had like 2 or 3 rounds of interviews and lots of waiting, lots of following up. And I finally got into YC, and then I was on that path.
That's amazing. I don't think if I you may have said that to me at some point, but how was that experience being part of that program?
It was pretty life changing. It happened remotely for us because of COVID. So I didn't have to travel. So I could skip some of the unpleasant parts of it, like looking for accommodation in the Bay Area and things like that. But it was just one of those like really intense experiences where you just meet such remarkably smart people uh, who accomplished so much in the same 3 months that you are trying to find your bearing, that it's almost like feeling the laws of gravity and defying. Like until then you can say, oh come on, how can you grow that much in 3 months? How can anybody do this? Like, oh, that's just like made up in retrospect. But there you just see people doing it in front of you, so it completely like warps your sort of like measurements, and like it shows you what you can do as an accomplished person if you really set your mind to it. um the friendships you make, yeah.
And you got in 20, what
20
year?
winter 21, which is more
When
like
did you get
January
in?
to March 2021, 2 years back.
Ja- January through
Yeah.
March 2021. And then so they give you some funding to let you do this 3 months. How does that work then? What happens
I
after the
mean,
3
even
months?
back in the day, they gave you a lot of money, right? Like, I mean, they gave you $125,000 for 7% of the company. And honestly, I would do it even without money. But now they give you a half a million. So it actually gives you a lot of money. They give you a lot of money. Yeah,
That is a lot
exactly,
of
right.
money.
And I think in 21 it started looking like it wasn't, but now, and it always has been a lot of money, to be very honest. They don't, at least now, they don't force you to raise any venture capital or something. They're always telling you to just be efficient with your fundraising. And but in 21 it was a different time, and I wanted to prove that I can raise a lot of money, and we did. Like I raised 4.5 million in total in those 3 months or 6 months, in that first year. And in fact, I think I was at least documented the first trans women to ever go through YC. And back in 21, at least that year, from what I could find, because I was just very curious, I was, I think, like the second transgender woman in the last 10 years to raise a venture capital round. So,
That's amazing. Congrats on that round. Like I don't you make it sound like it wasn't I know that couldn't have been easy to do. So, but you almost just yeah, I raised 4 point. I mean, what's the process there? I mean, you gotta what? You gotta throw your idea out to a million, or not a million, I guess, VCs. But could you just kind of describe? We got like a few minutes left, but I want to hear this story. Like, what was your process in? Because you didn't know anybody, right? You said, well, YC maybe
sure.
introduced you to the right people. Just can you give me 2 or 3 minutes of how you went from YC at 100,000, 125,000 raised to 4.5 million at the end of the year? Like, what was your strategy
I'll
and
give you the most honest answer,
how
even
did
if it feels a bit abstract. But I'll give you actually the most honest answer, and you can make what you want of it. But do you remember one of those video games we used to play where there would be like these blocks coming at you? You jump on one block, then you jump on the other block, and you have to get from one point to the other point. So I feel like startup life, and
okay.
especially raising money for me, certainly was like that. Where if I look back, like yeah, we got into YC. Getting into YC immediately gets you noticed because investors like signals from other investors. But then you sign up a customer that is quite influential, and they put in some money, or so you basically like take the next check and the next check, and the first checks are much harder, but the YC brand name helps. And so if you look back, like I don't know if you can retrace those steps really exactly. You definitely cannot. And so you go from like those 125,000 to another 200K raised in the next 1 month, which YC strongly advises you against, for very good reasons. But I just didn't want to. I operated from a place of fear. So I raised another 200K in 1 month. And then I raised another 1.7 million or so at demo day. But raising money is always about getting one person to say yes, and usually those they say yes obviously because they like you and your product, but also because they know if they do not make that decision today, somebody else will make it and invest in you and they lose their chance. That is always a strong component of that. So YC itself enables that through their demo day, right? Like it's like so many companies, so many investors. It's called FOMO, right? I mean, but you can also play into it. And I think like I just had it's like anything else. It's like sales, right? Like instead of selling your product, you're selling your company, you're selling equity in the company. You go into meetings, you go into low stake meetings, investors that will not invest in you or you don't like them, and you practice, you see what they tune into. And it's really just that. And that's why I think I feel really honestly, anybody who can build products like this, which is many people can raise money too, but I think people get too stuck up on like a certain like way of raising money, or I think you just have to be. I don't know if you've read the story of Steve Jobs where he went to Sony, he wanted Sony to invest in him and they said no, and he started crying. And uh, and then Sony invested in him. It's in his biography or something. Like many people don't somehow know about it, but I think like I'm a CEO like that as well. Like I'll beg, cry, whatever it is, and I think I did all of them, and that's the truth of it, and I'm glad I did it, and I would do it again if I had to.
What are you looking at for MagicBell? Like, what are your, at least today, because this stuff will change over time, but how would you describe success right now with this company? Like, what has to happen for you to feel like this business was a success?
I think it would have to become like a platform that people build on. Like for me, that is personally very inspiring and something I've always wanted to do. I've always sort of had this sort of a platform and enabling people to build on, the data model that you've built. I think Twilio was built in this world where SMS was the dominant channel for communication, at least asynchronously. And now we live in a very different world. And I think the world is ripe for a new Twilio, which doesn't really quite exist today. And I think in many other terms, being successful would be being that company. It's inevitable. Somebody will be. Will it be us
Brilliant.
or someone else? That's what we have to see.
That's brilliant. So you found a product and you found a space that is a almost a new frontier, or at least ripe for change, and you have others also believing in that because they're you were able to raise like a brilliant time to do it as you transitioned into your new life, right? It's a
Thank you.
really great way to start. I mean, I'm really
I
happy
mean, it
for
takes
you.
a village,
That's
genuinely, but
absolutely
yeah, thank
awesome.
you.
All right, so we're out of time. What a fascinating story. I say this to every guest. I could talk for another
But
hour. I
you're a
want to
great
talk for
host.
another hour.
Yeah.
Maybe we bring you back one day. Uh, if anybody wants to reach out to you to talk to you about anything that they've heard today, what is the best way for them to
I'd
do that?
say Twitter. My handle is Una Mas Hana, which is one more Hana in Spanish. So UNAMASHANA, Una Mas Hana.
We'll add that to the show notes. Thank you again. This was awesome, and it's a different story, and I think there's going to be a lot of people that are going to get a lot out of, and maybe even more confidence in what they're doing because they
I
see the
sure hope so. I
success that
mean, yeah.
kind of you had
Like
walking this
I
path.
genuinely think there's a lot more people who can do it and should do it, and I hope if I can inspire even one of them. And thank you so much for giving me that opportunity.
You're welcome. Brilliant. Okay, so this is Bill Kennedy and Hana Mohan saying goodbye, and we hope to see everybody again real soon.